Hi, I'm Dr. John Neufeld. You're watching Back to the Bible Canada. Welcome. Delighted to have you join me. I'm doing a series on this really short little book, 246 words or 245 words, 2 John. Maybe you've never done a study in 2 John, so this is your opportunity to do that. And it's got a lot to say about connecting these two big issues that need to be there in every believer's life. It's called truth and love. And so I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but today I want to talk specifically about how love relates to the commandments. So let me begin with an opening illustration that you might or might not be able to, identify with. But a story is told of a man. He's having a conversation with his wife, and he says to her, "Honey, what if it so comes to be that somewhere down the road, you're waking up in the morning, you look over at me and I'm snoring, and you say, I don't know if I love that guy anymore." And, I think there are people that worry about their own marriages that way. And she simply said, as long as I'm committed to Christ, I'm committed to loving you. In other words, Christ has commanded me to love you, and my heart will be directed towards Christ's command. Now, I want to think about the commands of God and the love that we have for one another. I think most of us who have known Christ for some time have observed that when our first answer to Jesus is, hesitant, I'm not sure, or a negotiation process, if that's our first answer, a lot of other things start going wrong in our own lives. But if our first answer, regardless of the command, is always yes, it's just instinctive, it's reflective, it's reflexive of the kind of a love that I have for him, then you know that our longings and our feelings and how we value people, they're just going to fall in line. In other words, the commands of Christ are never just temporal, they're not changeable, they're not reactionary, they're always obedience as our first commitment, and therefore it gives us this steadiness in life that we can be counted on many years down the road. So I opened with an introduction to 2 John the last time I spoke on this. So let me just do a little bit of review and remind you that 2 John, when you start to read it, you have to make a decision about what you're reading right off the start, because the letter starts by saying the elder to the lady elect. And the question sometimes is asked, who is this lady elect? And there are those Bible teachers and scholars who argue that the lady elect, that's a euphemism for the church. In other words, John's writing the church. He's calling the church the lady elect for any number of reasons. But they basically argue this way: because the church is called the bride of Christ, and because of the pervasiveness of persecution that was around when John was writing, perhaps he's writing to the church so that, that if somebody intercepted his letter, they'd not recognize it for what it was. I've argued against that position. I think there's not a veiled reference to the bride of Christ. I believe this letter was indeed written to an individual woman. See, I've tried to balance all of the evidence on either side, and I just don't find it convincing that the lady elect is code language for the church. My response always is, take the Bible as literally as is possible. And only if it's not possible to take it literally, that's when you take another approach. So here's an example. You want to think about it, but Solomon, in the Song of Solomon, says of the woman sings of her beloved, and she says, "He comes to me leaping over the mountains, bounding over the hills as a gazelle." Now, that's not to be taken literally. This woman has not fallen in love with a mountain goat. She has fallen in love with a man, but she sees his strength and, his athletic ability and all that kind of stuff, and she just loves what she sees. That's the whole idea behind it. So, she's using images that are meant to be understood as images. On the other hand, when you read the book of Genesis and you read about Isaac and Rebekah, and that Rebekah is brought into Isaac's tent, she becomes his wife, he loves her. It's straightforward language, it's literal language, it's meant to be interpreted literally. So I'm going to say the literary style of any passage will indicate how you're supposed to interpret it. And 2 John is a letter that's written to, the lady elect. And so I've got to believe that she's a literal woman. That's just a little bit of a replay of where I was at in simply reading this letter. Now, let me say a couple of other things. Here's what we know about this lady. I mean, obviously, we don't know her name. We don't know anything about her personal details. However, we know that she is a widow. We know that she was a woman of considerable means, so she was fairly rich. We also recognize that she would have had a very large house, which probably would have looked like an estate. And it had become a ministry center. It had been her habit to allow that large house to be used as a ministry center. I mean, perhaps and likely it would have been used for large church gatherings. She would have had all the space in the world for that. But it also became a kind of a hotel. So whether it's traveling missionaries or church planters or, preachers or Bible teachers, I mean, they always, when they were in the area, they would come and stay at her house. And there are a number of reasons for that. Hotels in that day were mostly seedy affairs. So you wouldn't stay there. I mean, they were usually considered places, of prostitution and all sorts of illegal activity. And so Christian ministers would not stay there. They would stay in houses. But we also noticed that when we told the story of 2 John, that 2 John comes along about 60 years after, maybe a little bit more, after the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. And in those 60 years, the church has begun, but the church has changed significantly. I mean, I made mention already that the church was no longer a primarily Jewish phenomenon. It was now, had come deeply into the Gentile world, many Gentile converts. It was no longer a church that was centered in Jerusalem. Jerusalem had already been destroyed, so it was no more. The center of the church was now in Ephesus, where John lived. And so we know that's true. We know the church has also gotten so much larger than its initial days. It's penetrated into city after city after city after city in the Roman world. And so the church has become larger in more cities. It's harder to maintain unity now because of the simple size of the thing. And the church has become more diverse than ever before, with more cultural and language groups a part of the church. So all sorts of things have been changing. And so you've got to know that when there are traveling missionaries, evangelists, preachers, and they're going to various churches, they're bringing their message to church after church after church. In that case, what you would really care about was the doctrinal foundation of those teachers. What indeed were they teaching? Because on the one hand, yes, it had become ethnically diverse, but you didn't want the church to become theologically diverse. You wanted to be constant over one basic truth, the truth for all delivered to the saints, and that same truth was to be taught and believed in all the churches. So that was the real issue. So when we come to verse 7, in fact, let me read to you verse 7, and we're not going to actually study that verse today. I'm going to leave that for next time. But it says, "For many deceivers have gone out into the world." And so John's very aware of this fact that, false teaching is everywhere. And so really, the letter of 2 John is to speak to this loving woman who's got all sorts of teachers coming into her house. And the whole focus of this very short letter is to say, hey, watch out, see what you're doing, make sure that what you're doing is in line with the gospel. So that's, I think, the importance of this letter. So John is writing this letter. It's a letter to this woman who's got a large place where there are constant visiting preachers, where church meetings are being held, and he's saying to her, be very careful who you let into your house. And, we can put that and apply that to our own situation and say, be very careful. Be very careful who you hire as your preaching and teaching pastor. Be very careful as the content of what's being taught and preached. On that matter, be very careful about the theology of the songs that you're singing as well. And be very careful about all the stuff that you're doing. So that's the content of it. So last time I read verses 1 to 3. So let me read now verses 4 to 6. And here we're starting to get at the content of this very short letter. John writes, I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. So those three verses are all that I want to discuss today, because I think there's a mouthful there. And if we go too quickly, we won't catch the significance of what's being said. So remember that John in this book is going to make this dear Christian woman face some very important issues, and they are issues in which she is failing. She has been allowing false teachers to stay in her home, and because her home is so prestigious, any false teacher who stays there immediately has a platform to spread his false teaching further. So it's that's given rise to this letter. However, notice also that the letter doesn't just kind of barge right in there, the kind of thing that some of us do. If somebody's doing something wrong and we barge in and say, hey, Fred, I want to talk to you because I've noticed that these are the kind of things that you're doing. They're harmful, they're hurtful, they're wrong, whatever it is, and we just let him know and we blast him with the truth. After all, that's what's happening. And what does Fred do? Fred immediately gets defensive and begins, he's back on his heels, but then he struggles to get himself on the balls of his feet and fight back, because that's the natural human instinct. When someone calls us up short, what we really feel like doing at that point in time is to say, no, you've got me all wrong, and I'm going to give you every reason in the world to do that. And the reason why we do that is because we feel that when someone's correcting us, that we feel that someone's attacking us. We feel that we're not valued. We feel that we're not loved. We feel that our contributions are not taken seriously. And all that person sees of us is that one thing that we're doing wrong, and we feel offended by that. Notice that John's approach to this woman is an approach which indicates to her that the person who wants to correct her is also the person who deeply, deeply loves her in Christ. He is thanking God for her, and he's encouraged by her commitment. So, he's speaking positively. And so what's John say? First of all, he says, well, I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth. Now, you might stop there and say, well, is that completely positive? Because it's just some of your children. That would mean that some of your children are not walking in the truth, and that's not good. Well, I have to say, first of all, I am sure that John probably didn't meet all of her children. So maybe all he's saying here is that the children that I have met, your own kids, the ones that I have had contact with, and remember I said before, she would have had a very large family, a great many children, that, the ones that he had met, they're walking in the truth. I remember years ago teaching at a Bible college in another country, and I spoke to one of the gals that were there, and I said, tell me about your family. Now, she was a student in my class, and she was sitting at the lunch table, and I said, tell me about your family. And she said, well, I come from a family of 16 kids. And, and you have to steady yourself and you say, okay, in North American terms, we just don't have, those kind of examples. So, I said to her, so tell me about your brothers and sisters. Are all of them in the Lord? And she said, they're all in the Lord. I said, well, let's be clear. Are they passionate about Christ? And she looked me square in the eye and she said, every one of my siblings are passionate about Jesus. And I said to her, why did your mom and dad stop at so few, just 15? Maybe they should have 20. I was just so encouraged by hearing that. Well, I can't say whether or not this woman's children were all walking in the Lord. It seems to, as I read this, that perhaps some of them were not and some of them were. But however it was in that family, there were a lot of kids, and John simply says to her, and by the way, we don't know when she came to Christ. Maybe she came to Christ, after most of those kids were born. Was she a recent convert and had now won some of her kids to the Lord? We don't know the background, but John says to her, I'm so encouraged when I think about you and I look at those kids that you have and the ones that I know, how many of them are walking in the truth. And I've recognized the impact that you've had on your family. So what am I saying here? So I put this down in my notes. This woman was seeing God's grace and mercy and peace in her family. God's grace was there. And it's such an important principle of leadership, I think. John is telling us that if he's got something to say to her, He doesn't barge right in and tell her what's wrong. He starts by telling her that these are the areas that I have noticed where you've had victory. These are the areas that I've noticed growth in your life. These are the areas that evidence the grace of God being felt in your life. And I'm very careful that even though I have to correct you in an area, that correction is not going to eclipse all of the areas in your life that I see that are going well. And I need to say that to all of us, especially when there's somebody in our own lives, maybe it's a fellow believer, or maybe it's not, but whoever it is, and they've got to be like a burr in your saddle. I mean, it's just, you can't just get along with them. I mean, maybe the time has come for you to stop for a while and sit back and say, maybe I should list all of those areas where God has deeply blessed them, and maybe I should let them know that I've witnessed this. And I'm going to say this, if we start our conversations on that, footing, we're going to find out how much better things actually are. So this woman has children that are walking in the truth. So that's the positive thing that he says. Now, he doesn't say that, now notice, yes, this is the thing. Watch what he says. I rejoice greatly to find that some of your children, he doesn't say are in the Lord. Some of your children have received Christ as Savior and Lord. Some of your children are now in the faith, or some of your children have become Christians. He doesn't say it that way. Watch what he says. I've rejoiced greatly. Some of your children are walking in the truth. So that's how John defines the Christian life, walking in the truth. So let's talk about that for a while. Now, by the way, that same formula gets repeated. So if you have a Bible with you, you might want to just skip ahead to the book of 3 John, verses 3 and 4. And in 3 John, he says something very similar to that. In verse 3 and 4, he says, for I rejoice greatly with the brothers and have come and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. And he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. So there's an interesting statement that's made. So a believer is not just someone who believes on Jesus, but a believer is someone who walks, who lives, or has a lifestyle that's consistent with the truth. It was Pastor Vance Havner who once said, what we live is what we believe. Everything else is just religious talk. So that's interesting language, isn't it? In other words, to walk is to live. That means that we know what's ultimately important in my life. So if I have to give up something, I know the hierarchy of things that I'm all about. I'll never give up the principles of my faith or the command for obedience. I know that. And ultimately also that means that I will know something about the doctrines of my faith. I'll know how those truths are expressed. I know something about, who is God? What is the nature of God? What is the nature of the Trinity? What are the two natures of Christ? You see, all of these things are important to my faith, including how is a person justified before God? What does it mean to actually believe on Him? How does the life of discipleship actually work? So, all of those things are a part of my life. But to walk in the truth also means that my ethics are in accordance with my belief structure. See, what I believe and what I do goes together. In other words, whenever we see, a well-known Christian leader who has a hidden lifestyle that's completely out of focus with the gospel that he preached or believes, well, we know immediately that the words come out of his mouth, they're one thing. But how he actually lives, that's what he actually believes. So John says walking on the truth is living a life that's consistent with the truth that you've received. And he says, I've noticed that about some of your kids. If I watch their lifestyle and I watch what Christ demands of us, it's completely consistent. That's what's happening in your family. And John says that's what's grace. So, the application point is very clear. We as parents, and I'm a parent, many of you watching me are parents, and if you think about your own kids, the thing that you want to pray for, and the thing that, especially if you have small kids in the home, the thing that you want to train them to do is not only to believe in the truth, but how to make the decisions in life that are congruent with the truth. So let me give an example. Mom and Dad, it has become very clear to me that, over many years, a great many Christian parents, when there is something that, conflicts with Sunday morning worship together in the church, skating lessons, dancing lessons, whatever it is, whatever other alternative there are, many believers will simply say, we'll just take a Sunday off from church. And what happens in your kid's life, they're not listening to your words anymore. They're listening to your walk. How are you walking? Have you made the worship of the one true sovereign God that thing in your life that cannot be interrupted, and everything else is less than that? See, if they haven't learned that from you, they're not going to be walking in the truth. And that's what John is saying to her. You're walking in the truth, dear elect lady. Your kids are walking in the truth, and that's a great blessing that I have. Okay, so I've made that point from verse 4. So let's go on to verse 5. He says, "And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another." You notice that? He's still not correcting her. In fact, I've already made the point that, if this woman erred on one side, she was more a love person than she was a truth person, and what she needed to find is the balance in her life. But John's not afraid to point to her that the love part of this equation is not something that I want you to have less of so that you can make up for that with truth. He's saying to her, no, I want you to plow more deeply into love than you ever have before. So this woman must understand that love is the basis of all of Christ's command. And John's quick to remind her that this love came from the beginning, he says. And I love this because from the beginning is this idea that, that John has that, from 1 John. John starts 1 John and he simply says, that which was from the beginning. And then he explains what he means by the beginning. He sees those things that we have, seen with our eyes, which we have touched with our hands. This we proclaim to you. In other words, he's speaking about Jesus. From the very beginning of the life of Jesus, there were eyewitnesses who were the apostles, who watched the things that Jesus did and who were directly trained by Jesus and then were commissioned by Jesus to write an accurate biography of his life. So when he talks about the beginning, he means the real Jesus that actually existed and that you have a certain knowledge of this real Jesus, the real historic Jesus. That's the one that was from the beginning. 1 John 2, verse 7, I'm writing you no new command, but an old command, and this is the word that you heard, and he means from the beginning. And 1 John 2:13, I'm writing to you fathers because you know him who was from the beginning. So John is saying to this woman, look again at verse 5. He says, I ask you, dear lady, not as though I'm writing you a new command, but one you have had from the beginning, that is, from the mouth of Jesus and in his physical life, that we love one another. You see, whatever you know about love comes from the real historic Jesus who taught on that subject matter, and I want you to major in it even more than you already have. Now, you think, well, where did Jesus, talk about love? Well, frequently, but let me give you the very easy example from, the book of John, chapter 13, verse 34, which relates to Jesus washing his disciples' feet. And after he's washed their feet, they're all shocked that he's washed their feet because only menial servants wash the feet of guests, and yet Jesus does it for his disciples. And then following that, he says to those who are in the room, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. And how did Jesus love them? Well, he had just served them. He cared for their needs. He wasn't afraid to humble himself to minister to them. That's what it means to love as Jesus taught us to love. Serve one another, meet their needs, sacrifice your own well-being for the good of others. That's the kind of love that we have from the beginning, from the mouth of Jesus, from his words and his actions. And so John says, look, I want to return you to the command from the beginning, the command that came from Jesus, that we love one another. But here we need to ask a question, because if this woman is tracking and if she's watching where John is leading her, He's going to have her concentrate on the fact that she's been asking false teachers to come into her house. And if she's allowing them to come into her house, she's going to have to ask herself this question: is inviting false teachers into my house a loving act that came from the beginning, or is it not? And that's where we're going to go, especially next time. So if we allow false teachers, we might be showing a callous disregard to protect and to serve the rest of the body of Christ, because those false teachers might create confusion. They might drive certain people from the faith. They might harm the most vulnerable among the people of God. So how loving is it to open your door to false teachers and invite them in? It might be the most unloving thing that you've ever done. So what John is going to ask her to act out of is not, become more of a truth person and less a love person. Rather, he's going to say to her, embrace fully the love of Jesus from the beginning. That is the kind of love he taught you. Because remember that Jesus, even while he embraced the least of these, the poor, the neglected, the marginalized, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, all those people found a place at his table, but who didn't? The false teachers like the Pharisees and the Sadducees were openly denounced by him. That's the kind of love that we have from the beginning. Now, continue to read. So he's telling her in verse 5, the kind of love we have for one another. Then verse 6, and he says, and this is love. He's about to define it. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. Now, I've noticed that in verse 5, he says, I'm going to give you a new commandment. And then in verse 6, he talks about the commandments, plural. So in verse 5, he's talking about the command to love one another. But the command to love one another, says John, now leads us to obey all of the commandments of Jesus. That in other words, whatever Christ has called us to do, we answer yes unreservedly. I mean, it's like it's kind of like a person in the military. His commanding officer says, I've got an order for you, and the soldier simply salutes and says, yes, sir. I mean, that's really what John is calling for this woman to have in relationship to Christ. So let me give you a number of examples of this. I don't think anybody can love anyone else unless they are obedient to Christ. So I've been a pastor for many years, and I know this. I would, on occasion, and sometimes more often than I care to admit, find individuals, even within my own congregation, who had left their own spouse and had begun to live with somebody else, and then come to church regardless. And I was very concerned about that, because that habit of, disobeying the orders of Christ, to be faithful to your spouse, and then to commit adultery, and then to live within that adulterous situation and then come to the church, is it loving for me to leave that person without discipline? Is that loving? Because if we say nothing about it, then we're basically saying, well, then, it's really okay. So in other words, if we don't insist on the commands of Christ, all of the commands of Christ, in the end, we're less than loving to the weakest and most vulnerable. Or think of it another way. Think of it in terms of the image that Paul gives of the nature of the church. Christ is our head, and we are his body. That's the image that's given. That the body is to submit to the head. That whenever the body doesn't submit to the head, there's something very wrong going on. There's a severe illness. You can imagine, walking to the edge of a cliff. The head says, time to stop. You don't have wings. You're going to fall over. But if the body takes over apart from the head, ultimately it results in destruction of everything. So John says, look, here's the thing. This is love. He says that we walk according to his commandments, and he means all of his commandments. This is the command. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in him. So let me try to repackage that in my own words. Here's the John Neufeld version. And this is the definition of love for other believers in the family of God. To be obedient to everything that Christ calls us to do. The obedience to Christ in all things is fulfilled in a single command to love each other. When we're obedient to everything that Christ commands us, we're also obedient to the law of love, and that's obedience to God. Now, let me end with an illustration. And the illustration is, and I don't know if this illustration is true or not, but I read it in a story about an African village, a tribal village, tall jungle grass, and a child had gone lost, couldn't be found. The tribal members scattered out, people went in various directions looking, and no one could find them. The next day they met together and said, what can we do? And they decided that they would hold hands and form a long line, and therefore they'd cover all the ground. Well, they did find the child, but unfortunately, because of the cold night air, the child had died in the night. And then the anguished mother cried out, if only we had held hands sooner. And I think that's what John is all about. I mean, you are called upon to hold hands with other believers, to in concert with each other. Don't break ranks in keeping the commands of God. Do all of the things that Christ commanded you to do, and do it in such a way that you keep holding hands with other believers in Jesus. And if you do both of those things, keep the commands and continue to insist on love, at that point in time, we will find that the rest of the matters, that is, the truth issues that we have to deal with, false teaching and other things that happen, these things can be dealt with in an attitude not of condemnation, but of love. So love then becomes the motivating factor. So that's the second lesson that we have from this book in 2 John. Here's a woman who's actively involved in her local church, and she thinks that love means that she has unqualified acceptance of everyone, regardless of what they are teaching or doing to the body of Christ. And John writes to correct her. That's not love. I want to take you back, he says, to love from the beginning. And love from the beginning is to have the kind of love that Christ commanded us to have. Don't define love on your terms. Define it on Christ's terms. Let him define it. Do it as he wants us to do it. And we will find that the church will continue to be loving while it does not stray from the truth. Hey, thanks for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada today, and may the Lord bless you on this day and watch over you. God bless. Thank you for watching today, and I want to ask you to make sure that you hit the like button and also subscribe to this channel so that you can receive any further notifications of all the videos that we prepare for you. Thank you so much for being a part of Back to the Bible Canada.